In the autumn of 1886, Cora Vane, a widow of 26 and 8 months into her black, refused to shoot the 60 shaggy, long-horned Highland cattle her dead husband had shipped west from Scotland. Cattle the whole of Sweetgrass Valley had already written off as walking rugs, and they laughed at the shaggy woman for a full season, right up until the winter came down like the wrath of God and left every sleek Hereford in 5 townships frozen upright in the drifts, every herd but hers. That is the shape of it. The rest is how a woman with chapped hands and a borrowed language kept her feet on ground that meant to bury her, and what she had read in a book that not one prosperous man in that valley had the patience to open. She was not a large woman. She went about that first cold season in her late husband's canvas coat, a thing built for a man half again her size, the cuffs turned back twice and still swallowing her wrists, the hem near her shins. Her hands were bad already, split at the knuckle from the wind, and she wore no gloves because gloves cost money, and money was the one thing 8 months of widowhood had taught her to hoard. She had a plain face gone brown at the cheekbones, dark hair she pinned without a mirror, and a habit of talking low to the animals in a scatter of Gaelic words she only half remembered. Words her Angus had used at the feed rail, sounds she kept saying because saying them kept him a little while longer in the yard. The cattle knew those sounds. They came to them. That was the first thing about her that the valley found ridiculous. Everybody knew what a beef animal was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a Hereford, white-faced and blocky and slick as a river stone. An animal you fattened fast and sold fat, an animal bred for the scale at the railhead and nothing else. The stockmen of Sweetgrass Valley knew this as plainly as they knew their own names. And what Angus Vane had dragged across an ocean and half a continent to a least quarter section under the crazy mountains was the opposite of all of it. Squat, matted, horned like something out of an old country tale, a red-brown mass of hair with eyes buried somewhere inside it, an animal that dressed out light and grew slow and looked, to a man leaning on a corral rail, like a joke a Scotsman had played on the plains before he had the decency to die of it. If you have ever kept a thing that everyone told you to be rid of, kept it past all sense because letting it go felt like a second burial, then you already know the ground Cora Vane was standing on, and you already know why this channel tells these stories. Stay with her. What the men at the Valley store were about to learn had been written down years before any of them was born, in a hand none of them could read. On pages Cora kept wrapped in oilcloth on her kitchen table. The book had been Angus's and his father's and a grandfather's before that. A stockman's memorandum book, its oilcloth cover gone soft and dark with handling, its pages crowded edge to edge in a cramped Highland hand, half English, half something older, the ink brown with age. Cora could not read all of it, but she could read enough. She read it at night by a single lamp, tracing the lines with a split finger, and what the book said in its patient, crowded way was that these cattle had wintered outdoors on the Scottish hills for 1,000 years and more, that the long outer coat threw off the wet, and the short woolly undercoat held the heat against the hide, that they did not need a barn because they carried the barn on their backs, that they would break snow with those horns to reach the grass beneath when every soft animal in the world would stand and starve on top of it. She read one line so often she wore the page pale, "A beast bred to the storm does not fear the storm." She did not fully believe it yet, but she had buried the man who wrote out the meaning of it, and she was not going to shoot his last argument in the head to please a valley that had never once asked her name. The valley had a name for her by the end of harvest: the Shaggy Woman. It started at the store, where the men gathered by the stove of an evening, and it ran the length of the road inside a week. The loudest of them, and the one whose voice carried the farthest, was a rancher named Wyatt Doyle, who ran 4,000 acres of good grass on the sunny side of the creek and wanted badly the least quarter section that Cora could not quite afford to hold. He was a handsome, heavy-shouldered man who wore a dark, flat-brimmed hat and the certainty of a man who had never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything. He did not hate her. It was worse than that. He was amused by her. He came to her fence line one bright, hard morning in the last of the good weather, sat his tall bay horse, and looked a long while at the cattle before he said anything at all. "You'll not winter those," Doyle said. "You know that." Cora went on forking hay and did not look up. They wintered 1,000 years without asking your leave. Not here they didn't. He shifted in the saddle, easy, unhurried. "I'll be straight with you, missus, because nobody else will." "Shoot them." "Take what the hired man gives you and put it against proper stock come spring, or against the note, either one. There's Herefords coming through in October cheap. A woman alone can run white-faced cattle. She cannot run a museum. They're not for sale, and they're not for shooting. Then they're for dying," Doyle said, without heat, almost kindly, and touched his hat and rode off along the fence toward his own broad, clean pastures, and left her standing in the cold with a fork in her hands and her husband's coat swallowing her to the wrists. That was the summer and fall of it. The mockery was not cruel so much as it was constant, and constant is its own kind of cruel. She came into the valley store one October afternoon, and the men by the stove did not even lower their voices. "There she is," one of them said. "You comb them this morning, missus, or let them go natural?" "You want to sell that hair, you'll want to cart it first," said another, and they laughed, and a third leaned back on his stool and drawled it out for the room. Angus Vane bought himself a herd of hearth rugs and died before he could get his money back. Now the widow's fixing to freeze alongside them and won't be told. Cora set her list on the counter and did not turn around. "The nails and a gallon of the lamp oil," she said to the storekeeper. "Quiet, and I'll thank you to weigh it honest, since the company's free with its advice today and short on its own business." That shut the stove a moment, and then it started up again behind her the instant she was out the door. A boy bleated at her from a wagon, and his father laughed and did not stop him. Cora loaded her flour and her lamp oil and her nails, and she said no more. And she drove home to the book and the lamp and the 60 red-brown shapes standing calm in a weather that was already turning mean. There was one who did not laugh. The valley schoolteacher, a spare, upright woman past 50 who boarded through the week and had buried a husband of her own out in the Dakotas years before, stopped Doyle on the store porch one evening in front of everyone and said one thing to him, quiet and flat. "You would not talk so to a man, Wyatt Doyle. You talk so to her, because she cannot leave." Doyle had no answer for that, and a man who has no answer laughs, and so he laughed, and the teacher walked down the steps and across to where Cora was loading her wagon and helped her lift the flour sack without being asked. "You needn't have," Cora said. "You'll only draw it onto yourself." "I have drawn worse onto myself than a rancher's temper," the teacher said. She settled the sack and dusted her palms. "I buried a husband on the Dakota line and stayed on my own place 4 winters after, and the whole territory had my land sold off in its head before the man was cold. I know that store. I know that stove. She looked at the 60 shaggy shapes bunched dark against the far fence. Tell me true. Do you keep them because you believe in them, or because you cannot bear to be the one who ends the last of him? Cora was a while answering. Both, she said at last. But the book is real, whatever the reason I'm reading it. He wasn't a fool, he wrote it all down. Then read it, the teacher said, and let them bleat. The two women did not say much more. There was not much more that needed saying. But Cora drove home that night a little straighter on the seat than she had come. The country began to close in early that year, and it closed in hard. The old men at the store, the ones who read the sky instead of the almanac, said the muskrats had built their houses high and the horses' coats had come in thick as bear hide by September. And they said it low, as men say a thing they are hoping to be wrong about. The grass had come up short after a dry summer, and the great herds of the open range, the vast speculator-owned herds that had flooded the northern plains in the boom years. Cattle bought on paper by men who had never seen them, those herds went into the fall thin, on grass already grazed to the dirt, with no hay put up and no shelter built, because the whole reckless faith of the open range was that the plains would feed them for free forever, as the plains always had. Cora put up hay. She put up more than sense seemed to call for, cutting the sloughs late and low, stacking it near the cattle where they could reach it, because the book said a highland beast will forage first and take the hay last, but a wise keeper stacks against the year the snow locks the grass away entirely. She patched her poor fences. She moved the cattle down off the high ground into the folds and coulees where the wind broke, because the book said, let them choose their own shelter and do not pen them. A penned beast fouls its own ground, and a free beast finds the lee. And all the while the note at the bank sat on her like a stone, and all the while Doyle's clean white-faced herd grew sleek and heavy across the creek, the picture of everything a cattleman was supposed to want. The dark of it came in December, before the true storm ever did. A cattle buyer came up from the railhead, a soft-handed man in a good coat, and the local Stockmen's Association sent 2 of their number with him. And the 3 of them came to Cora's fence and looked at her 60 Highlanders and made their report. The buyer would not name a price. He said the breed had no market, that the packers wouldn't take the small carcass and the long hair both, that a hide so coarse was worth next to nothing, and that in his professional judgment the animals were, for the purposes of commerce, worthless and unsellable. The 2 association men wrote it down and signed it and were sorry, they said. But the association would have to record that the vain herd was not creditable stock, and the bank, hearing this, sent word within the week that the note would be called in the spring, in full or the least land forfeit. She stood over the cattle that night with her husband's rifle in her hands. It was the coldest night the valley had yet seen, the sky scoured clean and vicious with stars, and the 60 shapes were bedded down calm in the coulee, breathing in slow clouds, chewing, at their ease in the cold that had already driven every sleek animal in the country to shivering. It would be a mercy, a part of her said, in a voice that sounded a great deal like Doyle's. Take what the hide brings, put it against the note. Stop being the joke of the valley. Bury the man and the cattle both, and be done. She stood there a long time. Her hands ached on the cold metal. And then she lowered the rifle, because one of the cows, a broad old matron with a wide sweep of horn, the leader of the little herd, had gotten to her feet in the starlight and walked to the fence and stood looking at her, unafraid, breath steaming, waiting for the low half-Gaelic sounds the way she waited for them every night. Cora went inside. She did not sell. She lit the lamp, and she opened the oilcloth book, and she wrote one line of her own in it, in English. Under 1,000 years of Highland hands, I am keeping them. God forgive me if I am a fool. The storm came in January. It came as judgment comes in Scripture, without much warning and past all appeal. It began as a warm spell, a false thaw that melted the snow to slush and soaked the standing herds to the skin, and then in the space of an afternoon the sky in the northwest went the color of a fresh bruise, and the temperature fell so far, so fast, that men afterward could not agree on how low, only that spit froze before it landed, and the soaked cattle turned to ice where they stood. The wind came behind it at a scream, driving snow so fine and hard it was less like weather than like sand, and it did not stop for days. They would call it the Great Die-Up, after the winter that broke the open range forever. Out on the flats, the vast speculator herds drifted before the wind because a cold animal cannot do anything but turn its tail to the storm and walk. And they walked into fence corners and piled against them and died in heaps. And they walked into coulees and were buried standing, and they walked, some of them, clean off the cut banks into the frozen rivers. Doyle's sleek white-faced cattle, the pride of the sunny side of the creek, huddled in the open with no coat worth the name and nothing on their backs but the slick hide the market prized, and they went down by the score, then by the 100, sleek and blocky and fat and freezing. They're bred for the scale bodies with nothing in them to hold a fire against that wind. And down in the folds and coulees, in the lee she had let them choose, the 60 shaggy Highlanders of Cora Vane put their horned heads down and their tails to the wind and stood. The long outer coat threw the snow off in sheets. The woolly undercoat held the heat against the hide. When the drifts locked the grass away, they swung those wide horns and broke the crust and grazed the frozen slow grass beneath, exactly as the book had said, exactly as 1,000 Highland winters had taught into their blood before ever a white sail crossed to America. Cora forked them what hay she could reach, and mostly they did not need it. They calved in the worst of it, calves dropping into snow and getting up shaggy and steaming and alive. A beast bred to the storm does not fear the storm. She had read it 100 times by lamplight. Now she stood in her husband's coat in the howling dark and watched it be true. The wind blew itself out at the end of the month, and then the country lay under a hard, bright, merciless glare of sun and snow, and the counting began. And the counting was the end of a world. Whole herds gone. Ranches that had gone into winter worth a fortune came out of it worth the price of the hides their men could pry from the drifts. Men who had laughed on the store porch in October did not come to the store at all in February. They were out on foot in the glare, dragging carcasses, saying nothing. It was March before Doyle rode Cora's fence line again, and he came slow, on a gaunted horse, and he did not sit and look this time. He drew up and he stared, and a man who has never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything stared across a wire fence at the one thing he had been most certain of in all his certain life, and saw that it was ash. On his side of the wire, the snow lay unbroken over the humped, frozen shapes of the finest herd in Sweetgrass Valley, sleek and white-faced and dead. On her side there was steam. There was movement. 60 red-brown shaggy cattle stood pawing the melt, wide horns down in last year's grass, and among them a dozen new calves stood on their own legs, shaggy already, breath rising, alive. The only living herd for 30 miles in any direction he cared to look. Cora was out among them in the canvas coat, with the cuffs turned back twice, forking a little hay, talking low in the borrowed words, and she did not gloat. She did not so much as face him. She had no need to. The whole silent, steaming, living tableau of it did the speaking she would not do. Doyle sat his poor horse at the fence a long while. Then he took off the dark, flat-brimmed hat, which no one in the valley had ever seen him do at a fence in his life, and he held it against his chest, and he said her name for the first time in the year he had known her. Mrs. Vane. She turned then and looked at him and waited. "I told you to shoot them," he said. His voice was not the easy, amused voice from across the water. "I sat that horse right there, and I told you to put your husband's cattle down and buy proper stock. I was wrong. I've been wrong since October, and half the valley's dead in the drifts to prove it, and I'll not stand here and pretend otherwise." He turned the hat in his hands. "I did not come to buy your land. Hear that plain. I came to ask if you'd teach a fool how you did it. And when the grass comes back, and a man's earned the standing to ask it, whether you might let me call." Cora looked at him for a long moment across the wire and the melting snow and the year of it. "You can learn," she said at last. "The book taught me. It'll teach you." As for the other, and here something moved at the corner of her mouth that in a warmer season might have been the beginning of a smile, "The grass has a long way to come back yet, Wyatt Doyle. You've time to earn it." He put the hat back on. He said he was obliged. And he rode off along the fence the same way he had ridden 100 times, only slow now, and bareheaded again before he'd gone a length, as if he'd forgotten how to wear the certainty. They came after him, the rest of them, all through that ruined spring. They came as people always come when the thing they mocked has become the only thing left standing. The young ones came first, the sons sent to the fence with their hats in their hands. One boy stood at the wire, twisting his cap, and could not get it out for a moment, and then it came in a rush. "My father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here, and he'd tan me if he did." He looked past her at the shaggy calves standing steaming in the melt. "I just wanted to see how they lived through it, missus, when ours didn't. Could I touch the coat? I told my brother it couldn't be real, all that hair, and he told me I was soft in the head, and I have to know which of us was right." Cora looked at him a long moment, and then she opened the gate. Then the fathers came. The soft-handed cattle buyer came back up from the railhead, not to condemn now, but to ask what she'd take for breeding stock, for bull calves, for a start in the shaggy blood. The Stockmen's Association that had signed the paper calling her herd uncreditable sent a man to record, formally, that the Vane Highland line had wintered the die up entire, and to enter Cora's name and her methods into their book, and the schoolteacher, when she heard, walked out to the ranch and took both of Cora's bad hands in hers and did not say a word. Because between the two of them there was still not much that needed saying. Cora did not get rich. That is not what these stories are for, and it is not what happened. But she held the land. She paid the note down with the price of bull calves that half the valley suddenly could not buy fast enough, and within a few years there was Highland blood in nearly every serious herd from the creek to the crazy mountains. thick coats coming in on cattle that had been slick and dead as spring before. Because a country learns, in the end, even when it learns the hard and frozen way. And she kept the oilcloth book on the kitchen table, and she kept writing in it, English lines under the old Highland hands, and she wrote down the winter, and she wrote down the calves that lived, and she wrote her Angus's name where it belonged, at the head of a thing that had proved him right a continent and an ocean and a grave away. The Shaggy woman, the valley had called her, and the valley went on calling her that for the rest of her long life, only somewhere in that ruined spring, the words had turned clean over in the mouth and come out meaning the opposite of what they'd meant in October. She became the woman the whole country came to, the one whose cattle had stood, the one who had read the book. If you have made it this far, then you are the kind of person who understands what it costs to keep a thing the world has told you to be rid of, and to keep it in the cold and the mockery on nothing but the word of someone you loved and buried. So let me leave it with you, plainly, before we go. When the whole valley tells you to shoot what your own heart says to keep, when every prosperous certain voice says, put it down and buy what everybody buys, do you obey the valley and stand slick and safe in the drift come the killing winter? Or do you keep the shaggy, stubborn, unfashionable thing that was born to weather it and trust that it knows something the market has forgotten? Tell me in the comments which one you would have been. Tell me your county, and tell me the shaggy thing you kept. Subscribe and stay by the fire with us, because there is one of these stories in every county in America, and we are going to keep telling them one hard winter at a time for as long as you keep coming to the fence.